I'm glad you guys could be here. We're going to talk this month about the Art of Community, a book that is by Jono Bacon. It's mostly about building community within open source, with a concentration on open source communities. Some of our agenda, we're gonna talk about the book. We always do with book reviews. We try to do some type of mind map so people can follow along if they didn't finish reading all of it, or if they just feel like concentrating or contributing to the mind map. I think it's editable, and we can maybe concentrate on some things people wanted to dive into. I've always found that it helps people and brings them along, so we can all move along at the same time. But if you have your own notes, tell me if you want to do a screen share, and I'll pull those up or focus on your screen. And then we're going to have an open discussion and then talk about the next meetup. So keep that in mind as we're going through. A quick, like a guest response. Did you guys get a chance to read through the book, or did people concentrate on one chapter more than others? I made it all the way through. I did a text-to-speech and made it all the way through the whole thing. But what did you guys think?
I read the first couple of chapters and then switched to the governance. I went through that and then focused on the last one, which I've been working on, is handling conflict. One thing to note is if you have the paperback versus the PDF and the paperback have different chapter numbers. So we labeled it as 9 or 3, 8, 9, 10, but it may be different depending on the book that you have. The names of the chapters seem to be the same. In any case, handling conflict was the last one I was focused on.
Okay. Anyone else?
Yeah, I focused on the communicating clearly, and then skimmed the governance and conflict, and I didn't get to creating and running events.
All right. If I'm wondering if anyone else feels comfortable leading us through any of the chapters. If you want me to go first, I can, or if one of you, we have communicating clearly here first, so we don't have to go in that order if you don't want to, but let me know. I was just going to go straight to governance. I don't know if we have notes in here. Oh, we do. That. I mean, before I even get into the notes, Lucy, Taylor, what did you guys think, or anyone else that read the book? What did you guys think about this chapter, the communicating clearly? Did you find it to be useful? Did you find it to be like the best thing you ever read about communicating, or was it specific to? Did you find it to be specific to communities? I mean, what was your critique on this?
I thought it was very relatable, and saw parallels in how John O'Bacon was wanting to manage open source communities versus how the cooperative organically manages community. And so it was good to hear, like, oh, we are trying to do that. We are trying to cater to our audience in the mode and method and language that we use for communicating with our team. So I don't know if I thought it was groundbreaking, but I thought that it was a good confirmation that at least what we're trying to do at Volt Cooperative is in line with how John O'Bacon would organize a community at Ubuntu.
Okay. And counterintuitive but true, insightful things do you guys see?
I don't know if I could claim that for sure. It might be related, and related to what Lucina was just saying. The goal around these communities and volunteers is somewhat, it is aligned with co-ops. It's different in some other ways. There's some areas where I would say on all the chapters that I read, there's a feeling of we have to cut some things and we can't handle all of it. So what is the highest, most urgent issues to deal with, or what are some techniques that we need to use that are most effective, where it's not that other things don't work, it's just that you may not have the control to put everything in place. So that was, I think, a good thing for me to read and think where are some areas where we could cut back even as far as a cooperative and say prioritize something else. And we're dealing with open source groups, and if you're in a project, so what are those important parts to do? So I found that interesting because it changed a little bit of it, and especially when he pointed out some things that I think are important and said, yes, these are good, but you may not get to them, so here's some other areas where there may be a bigger impact.
That's cool. There's one thing I remember, I believe it was from this chapter, where he was talking about onboarding and the communication that goes along with the onboarding. Maybe it would come in the form of blogs, maybe it would come in the form of a ticket system, but trying to take low-hanging fruit, maybe documentation or just small fixes where people can have quick wins and onboard community members that way. So they had some good success with that, I believe. I found that stuck out to me because I guess it's kind of in conflict with having a bunch of tickets lying around that are not high priority, but you know, they kind of sit there on maybe the aging report or something. It kind of goes in conflicts with that a bit. But in order to, if it's an open source community and you're working on trying to get some type of software out the door, it could be really any project that you're trying to have a community around it, trying to have people engaged, kind of having a pathway for them to onboard includes having them do something that contributes, and you kind of have to spell it out. So it almost takes more work defining the problem and making a ticket for them. Or, I mean, if you're using GitHub issues or whatever, I think they were using Tracker or Bug Track or something, or Bugzilla, I forget. But describing that, it may seem like a waste of time to everyone except for the people who are trying to build the community. So I've noticed this also with some of the other communities that we work with. they're always needing documentation done, but it's very, very technical documentation. And you kind of think, well, you know, any people can jump in, but there's really no tickets for it. And it's kind of, you don't know if you're just going to work on something and then they'll just throw it away. Whereas Bacon is saying, actually try to make it, I mean, you could do the documentation yourself, but just go ahead and make the ticket so good that it'll be low hanging fruit for someone to jump in. Do you guys remember that part?
Yeah, it's here as talking is easier than doing. So you can talk and talk and plan, but then you may make the task to be too complex and difficult to track and difficult to implement. So he's suggesting you want to build a culture around doing things and making things happen. So you could encourage everyone to contribute no matter how small. So that would be have a quick planning meeting, have a quick task, contribute a quick win, and then folks are all excited to help with the next thing.
Yeah,
I like hearing we've been attending a lot of different communities and groups the past several months especially, and I'm starting to really notice the ones where there's people asking, what does that mean? And then the people that respond with trying to clarify what something means. And the difference that makes in the group dynamic and I think where the discussion goes. So that's tied right into, I think, what you're talking about with the bike shedding and everything else. So.
cool. All right. Anyone else have anything about this communicating clearly in general with as far as building a community?
Yes, I do. So it mentions be a leader. So communities want to lead and set the tone for their group, but also be open to be inspired by role models. So I think that we've been in a unique position where we are attending a lot of meetings and we're seeing what's working and we're seeing what's not. And we've also been able to adjust some of our processes and some of the way we hold meetings, some of the ways that we communicate based on things that we do over and over on these calls that are working. So we've adjusted our own way of communicating that are working better for us as well.
Excellent. Anyone else? All right. I'm going to move over here to governance. This is a chapter that I concentrated on, mostly because we're talking about cooperatives in this meetup. So talking about a community and how it's governed, it's interesting to get the viewpoint of someone who manages a large partial volunteer, partial professionally paid community. So in Ubuntu, which is John Bacon. So the first thing I found it pretty cool that he had some arguments for when you say governance, he immediately talked about the resistance to the word, and he had some interesting examples. So whenever someone says, "Do you like government?" or "You don't like government," what has government ever done? Some big things. I like his example of saying, well, rebuilding Europe in World War I and World War II. I don't think that could have been done using free markets. So I think that's a great example. He has other ones in here, but I found that to be pretty good because it includes a lot of coordination and things like that. So things that we typically, the argument against large, governing bodies is that it can't be efficient or it's not organized. So some things as far as why you want to have governance. I think one of the things that he said within the chapter is that, once you get over a certain size, I think I have it down here somewhere, but once you get over a certain size, you're going to need some type of governance. And one of the things that it does is it ensures transparency if you run it in a way where it has transparency. So yeah, here we go. So community of 100 members, you're probably going to need governance. If you exceed 1,000, you definitely need it. Conflict resolution. I mean, if you've been around in the old forums with the flame wars and how things used to be in like the Linux community, there's all types of conflict, high profile forks and things like that, where people were really, I mean, I think it was the origination of the term flame war. So, or the phrase flame war. So, governance allows people to have their ideas bubble up and be considered and voted on, maybe in a democratic fashion, or maybe, then we'll get into it later, with a benevolent dictator, but there's a way to resolve a conflict instead of it being whoever yells the loudest on Usenet or whatever you're using. Now, I guess would be whoever yells the loudest on Slack. Big one that stood out to me was the addressing commercial interests. We've run into that in some of the things we were getting into as well. How is it that if you have some important software, how do you deal with a certain portion of that open source software being influenced or paid for by a corporation versus the rest of the community being volunteers? So in order to even address that, you're going to need some type of governance in order for the decision making to be public, and for you to help with the conflict resolution and these types of things. Otherwise, they're going to think that you're corrupt. The community will. So accountability is a big part of the usefulness of governance. So I'll put this down here. It helps with the community instead of having a massive mob where everyone just works on whatever they want to, and then they get it done whenever they want to get it done. This has worked, in the past. Software has come out of or merged out of communities like that. But having it to where people can be publicly accountable, just in any way, shape, or form, is a benefit for communities. So that's another, and governance helps with that. And it's a central place for people to be accountable. Any questions so far, or any comments?
I don't really. Okay, so the only thing I'm thinking is it's very interesting to see the larger groups. I've looked at stuff like Apache Foundation, somewhat OpenStack and stuff. The governance in those larger groups seems like it's almost, I don't know, I guess it reminds me like of a country where you have the country level than the smaller groups, and so the interactions are very, very interesting. If we relate it back to a cooperative where the governance, I guess it is kind of a combined, because you have lots of, potentially the way we are as software cooperative, lots of projects and stuff, but that dynamic with how do you have the larger entity and then dealing with all of the smaller governing groups, like with the SIGs, special interest groups within Kubernetes and other stuff. So I guess seeing and reading the breakdown here is, especially around the Ubuntu, and then applying that back to some of the other groups is interesting.
Yeah, we're going to get into the different, he has some different structures, recommendations that might apply to what you're talking about here in a bit.
Cool.
Anyone else so far? I'm going to move a little bit faster. All right, so he has some opinions on what leadership is. I found the one thing that I found to be that to ring true to me the most was the inspiration portion. And I would say maybe even translate or change that a bit to say influence. So if you're influential, you're leading. If you're not influential, you're not leading. But inspiring is another way to say that. And he says, he talks a bit about that. And you want to inspire based on your values that you try to jot down within your governance. Like when you're initially codifying your governance structure and all these things like that. Some properties, he was saying, willing to listen, unbiased, detail oriented, reliable, fair fighter. Yeah. You know, some kind of maybe obvious things, but the inspiring is something I thought someone might think might be a little bit counterintuitive, because people think of leaders a lot of time, they think of command and control, and they don't think of someone that's kind of like a multiplier who will influence other people or inspire other people to take on new tasks or to be more creative and these types of things. So I found that to be useful. So he has 3 different ways to talk about structures for governance. One of them is the Dictator. Plenty of interesting things in there. A lot of communities are run, open source communities are run as a benevolent dictator. And there's the Enlightened dictatorship, right? So there's no formal leader, but the leadership is determined by reputation. So this ends up being maybe what some people will think of as a meritocracy. So whoever's creating, they're the ones that will have maybe a natural influence over the group. And then there's the delegated governance. And this one is the more formal series of small units that all fit together, form a single governing body. This is the one that he recommends. That's going to be more like the Apaches and the Kubernetes and so on and so forth. So let's talk a little bit about the Dictator. One thing to, I guess, yeah, with the Dictator, I didn't put it in here, but there are valid, people think of Dictator and they think of, I don't know, Saddam Hussein or something like that. There are actual valid real life dictators, okay, like these here. Supposedly, these were good dictators, or decent, and they did all kinds of things that were positive in their countries. But we don't ever hear about them so much. We hear more about the ones that are, executing people. So within software, we've got two examples: Linus Torvalds and Guido von Rossum. So they make, or originally created, Linux and then Python respectively. And those communities were, very influential, but there were some issues with them, and he recommends against this, the dictator-led. There isn't as much transparency, and the biggest one that I've heard repeated is the bottlenecks. Right. So and then Taylor, remember the joke about when we were at a conference last year, and Linus was being interviewed by a young person, and then they came up with a scenario where they kind of jokingly talked about Linus being hit by a bus, and I didn't get the joke. It seemed completely inappropriate, but evidently this is there's some context there where that joke is used a lot when we talk about dictators and open source benevolent dictators. So I guess it was appropriate.
Wow. Okay.
Right.
So who is the replacement dictator? We found one. Yeah.
Yeah. Completely inappropriate analogy if there isn't already a running joke about it.
Yeah.
So if we didn't get anything from this book, now we have some closure about that joke.
That's great. Thanks. I guess that is, if we take it out as not a joke, but if we say that you have someone who's in charge and doing a great job, overall people agree, and then that's a weakness in that model, or with the benevolent dictator.
Yeah, it's a resilient. There isn't any resilience, right? So, but then also the big thing was that I read about was Linus wasn't able to take they didn't really call them pull requests back then, but he wasn't able to take the patches fast enough. So there are big swaths of developers at Intel submitting all kinds of things for fixing the kernel, and he just was like, no, I'm sorry, I'm going to go on a vacation now.
You're saying pre-Git?
Yeah, 90s.
Yeah, that's fine.
It was one of the reasons they, trying to make Git, but Git didn't solve that problem. It was him delegating.
That's true.
Right. So, there are ways to handle it, but it's kind of like then you get mini dictators, right? So, or I don't know what you would call them. If you have the king and you have his court, so you get like, I don't know, dukes or something. It's like, oh, you're in charge of this, device drivers, or you're in charge of the user space, or however they split it up. All right, so enlightened dictatorship. This is the meritocracy. KDE runs this way. This one, and he had some pushback on the enlightened dictatorship in the form of kind of like a herding cats type of critiques. But on the other side, like, if you're going to be, there's a strong argument for, if you have these really prolific developers just kind of strong arming their way through some code that isn't very maybe like sexy. It isn't really popular. It isn't stuff that anyone wants to do. I think there was a part of his, the example within KDE, I don't have it on here, but I think it was KHTML. No one wanted to do it, I think. And you're probably going to end up being in an enlightened dictatorship in that situation. And you have the small group that's going to maintain, or even a larger group that's going to maintain that. And then it's just whoever wants to get those features done, they're going to power through. There isn't much you can do about it. But the delegated governance model is the one that he recommends. It's really one for, I guess, the bigger groups, but he says he finds it the most appropriate, open, transparent, and conducive to a robust community. Let's see here. It's complex, so that's the thing to remember about this. This was another thing that jumped out to me. If you're running your community in such a way to where you just do a bare majority vote on things instead of having a council that does it, he thinks that it's not well governed, and then there can be destructive conflict. So, and I think, keep in mind, he's talking about communities that are, like he said, between 100 and 1,000 people. So he's found that this type of governance is less destructive than just a bare democracy, I should say. So there, he talks about how you should do some of the planning, and I think he made a distinction between the governing council and teams, right? So some examples of what the governing council would do: membership approval, rejection, conflict resolution, project values, community process changes, and ordaining other governance bodies, and then direction, like steering committee. And what they don't do, he made a point to say that the governing council doesn't do features. So was counterintuitive to me, but probably true. They don't act as a bottleneck, and to choose people for small, straightforward roles, and they should not be approving new teams. People should just form their own teams for solving tasks. The governing is more a higher level situation. And commercial sponsorship was a big part of governance, as far as how do you manage and try to seem like you're not corrupt, at least, for your community. And one of the solutions, so it's kind of, okay, if you have this open source software project and you have a governing council, okay, how many seats? If there's 10 seats, let's say it's Ubuntu or, Cisco or someone, 10 seats, and Cisco has 5 seats, and then they split the rest up with everyone else, or they have 6 seats and they split the rest up. You might as well just not even have a council. Essentially, it's just a play. He says that they should do it something. Well, one way that Ubuntu did it is the guy that started Ubuntu, his name is Mark Shuttleworth. He only has one guaranteed seat, right? So all the other seats can be other individuals, other companies, or whatever. So that's how they set up their council. Any questions about governance? Any comments? All right. So we got handling conflict. Taylor, did you do this one?
Yeah.
Okay. You want to give some high level? We got about 15 minutes, 20 minutes. So I give a high level and then go through.
Sure. I took a lot of my notes on paper and then while reading the paper copy, because there was a few things that I'd read there that weren't in the PDF. I don't have everything in here. I'll finish mind mapping it though. So yeah, let's start high level. What's that?
The physical violence is never acceptable.
Yeah. They put in there bold, and it's interesting also because it says whether or not you should make that public or not. It's just something if anything happens. And I think that's also just safety. So it doesn't have to be physical violence, but the threat of it or anything. So addressing that, so I guess it's fine to bring that up first, is the biggest thing. There's no tolerance of that. And whether or not it's stated doesn't matter. It's if something happens, then it has to be dealt with. I thought that was interesting that he said that you may or may not want to actually publicize that. That's just not okay. People can act weird about it. Okay, the sun just, I'm having a shift, y'all. Sorry, the sun just started to hit me in the eyes. So the top thing here, we'll just start at the top here on the mind map. Conflict will occur. So this is kind of a good reminder. Everyone knows that we have conflict. One of the things it's talking about is it doesn't matter what you do in a group, what type of preparation, what you've learned from other communities, how careful you are on who comes in, checking in with everybody, everything else. It's still going to happen because of dealing with people, and we're complex, and there's going to be something that's not going to match. So learning to preempt conflict early and stuff, and warning signs in the community is good. There's a lot of little things in there. I didn't write all those down, but I think it's community specific. You kind of learn those and then bringing them. In the volunteer side, it's more about like how the precipitation, if those are dipping, if you're going to have some people that might be louder or whatever, which is fine. It's if the rest of that's going off, but watching for some of those sort of things. And then trying to deal with that early. So let's see. 3 elements often present in conflict. So the people with strong personalities are very confident. They're going to speak the word. They're passionate. So this isn't a problem. It's just you're going to see that. So knowing that it's about the goals and values of those people and the passions and what they're seeing in the community, which is often it was talking about perceived goals and values. So not that the two parties that are in conflict actually have conflicting goals or values, but the perceived goals and values are in conflict. So that's important for someone trying to help to deal with the conflicts. And tying in with that perception, this does it highlight whenever I click on it? Oh, there it did. Yep. Cool. So the way that they interact and communicate those perceived goals and values, that's where the real conflict is versus, again, the goals and values might be fine if they could be communicated. It's how the interaction happens. I thought that metaphor with food was good. So lots of personalities, and those are the strong flavors. If they mix wrong, you got bad food that no one enjoys. If they work well, then it complements. We like it. So it's going to happen. So I figure out, what do we do? So this was also of interest for me, the volunteer versus formal worker company. And as a co-op, we are kind of a mix, in my mind, of volunteer, especially the way that we're structured as a software cooperative, volunteer versus formal. So I guess I'll just say, so we're worker directed. Everyone is independent, and the idea is with us is if you're a member owner, then you're your own business owner, and you're trying to direct your own life. And so then we're coming together as a group. So you could theoretically walk off and do your own thing and leave the group. So to me, that's the similar side to volunteer, like open source communities and stuff, where someone is contributing code and they don't have to. And I guess I'm thinking about the ones who are doing it because they want versus maybe a company's paying them to do it. And then that versus the other side, like if you think of just a company where you're an employee and you pretty much have to do what they say, or you got to go search for a new job. And we're a blend, like I was saying, that the co-op making money and some of the things. So the volunteer side on that spectrum, more sensitivity for dealing with conflicts than you would in a company such side. They could leave rather than dealing with conflict. It's so that I guess the barrier for exiting is a lot lower than a company, and the conflicts between different parties could cause other members to leave. In a company where you're an employee, that's less likely to happen. If you're seeing some conflict, it's harder for you to move, so you may deal with it, and it goes away. So it's, again, the barrier to exit. So just thinking about how you deal with these things. Okay, so I'm going to scoot over to sources of conflict. That's what I kind of labeled this grouping. I was still trying to figure out where these go. So that was kind of conflict will occur, and then we got personalities, and then, oh yeah, sources of conflict. Okay, so personalities is this next part under sources of conflict. Actually, I'll give a quick overview. So under sources of conflict, I got personalities, and then communication from the community. So this is removing barriers of input. So if the community doesn't feel like they can communicate, so that's another source of conflict. And then not knowing who's responsible for handling issues, that's a problem. Kind of related to the input, but not exactly. And then when people feel that conflicts aren't being resolved, lack of justice. So those are the four main things that I wrote down out of this book for source of conflict. So on the personality side, start with that one. So everyone's on a spectrum. This is, again, everyone's different. We have lots of different backgrounds. And then for the book, it's talking about where we are with regards to how we interact with the community. So in a open source project, you would love for people to be polite and very engaged. And then you have folks that are frustrating and complaining, and they're not contributing, maybe they don't have any issues or writing things down. They just complain on a mailing list without giving details or whatever, or people that are being rude to other people and everything else. So there's a spectrum that people see people on that, and most members are really going to be kind of in the center, and then sometimes you may think someone is irritating, and it turns out that that's whether your perception or the way they came in, and they could be a good contributor. So I wrote that down because I thought that was good. So some factors to leading to differences: age, culture, opinions. He talked about people that have more opinions. I wrote expressing more. I've found that a lot of times people have lots of opinions, but they may just be the type of person that doesn't express them, or they express them rarely, or they will only express them after a long while of feeling safer or whatever. So anyways, I thought that's a difference between just more opinions. Culture, that can be all sorts of things. So that could be different countries, of course, and that sort of thing. It can be within your country, cities. It could also be you've spent a lot more time with companies, or you've been startups, enterprises. I think all of everything ties into that. The age, I see you've highlighted the older set in their ways, and it specifically points out this isn't always the case, but you're just kind of saying general rule of how things go, and not bad or anything. There's just people interacting. Experience. He was talking more about experience in a community. So if you've been in, say, the Linux kernel community for a long time versus you've only started interacting in that for a couple of months, there's going to be a difference for those two parties. Also, if you've been in a lot of other open source communities versus you've never been in one, that can make a difference. Anyways, okay, so poisonous people. This was separated from the spectrum of where people could be and personalities in general. And he pointed out early that you could go into psychology and start looking at all sorts of things, and he didn't want to do that. He's saying, you're dealing with large groups, so I'm going to keep it at a higher level and try to be more functional in what you could do. So I'm not going to go into that because I have some thoughts, but poisonous people, we're talking people that are being very offensive. They continue to make everyone stressed out. Maybe they're blocking stuff, not giving access, whatever the things are happening that seems to be a major conflict for a large group in the community. Often they may be building lots of or subgroup where they're getting people to start having problems with things. Anyways, he points this type of thing out because it can occur if they come in, and you need to be very careful, limit the damage, make sure that you're very much on evidence, fact base. You can try to talk with them and everything, but just know that you got to be careful with this. He goes through and talks about more things on how you can deal with it. Anyways, I'm going to go on. So after personalities and other source of conflict, resolve barriers of input. So this is about communication. And do people feel like they can actually communicate with the different people in the group, the members, the leaders, everything else? So volunteer communities are all about open communication. They're coming in, they want to feel like they can have an impact, that people are listening to them. They have visibility on the impact that they have, the words. It doesn't mean that everything that someone brings up, we're going to go with, we're going to act upon. It's about we're going to have a way for people to communicate what their concerns are, what they're passionate about, and that's at least the capability to go in there if they're following along, polite and all the other things. But make that sort of thing available. Let's see. Don't respond to criticism immediately. So if people are coming in and they actually point out problems, especially if maybe they've opened a ticket and they've outlined stuff and taken the time to try to do specific things, and maybe it's in an area that everyone loves, but listen because they may find a real problem that exists. Try to invite feedback if maybe someone's brought something up, but they haven't created an issue. So this could be create issue. I'll put that right there. on an open source project. So maybe someone brought it up in IRC or on a mailing list or on a call. So invite them to create an issue and write some stuff out about it. Paid sponsors, that's a big deal, especially in the open source communities or volunteer communities where, yeah, I put this in, determine what are their goals and make them visible. That he kind of wrote it a little bit different, but that's how I was saying it and what my concerns would be. If it's not visible to everyone else, then that could lead to fear from the volunteer members. And you want to listen to people that if they're saying they don't feel like they're being heard, it again can just be perception. Maybe they think the paid sponsors are getting more of a say. So make sure that they do feel heard. Trying to use open tools so that other people can feel they can participate. It said developer participation. I'm going to put it's actually sponsored. It's not working for me. So on that developer precipitation, encourage if you have the capability to do like paid sponsored things so people can get in. They're saying, okay, we're putting our money where our mouth is and saying we're listening to the community. So let's go on. Who's responsible? I'm kind of running along here. I guess I'll pause for a minute. Does anyone have any questions or comments before we go on? Okay, cool.
We got about 5 minutes.
Oh,
7
okay.
minutes, so.
Okay, I'll try to run a little faster then. So responsible, who's responsible? Goes through different groups. It could be there. I thought this was good though. People, if you have people wearing too many hats and then become unresponsive, you're not handling maintenance and that sort of thing, that can cause concerns and frustrations with the volunteers. Make sure that talking about those sort of issues is publicly available so that everyone knows and you can address those concerns, including spreading responsibility. So that's good. Lack of justice. So make sure that everything is, don't leave lingering issues around. Make sure that you're seen to act, responsive to concerns. So everything around conflicts, make sure it's available to all the members and that they're saying that it's being addressed. Let's see, how to resolve. I'll jump over that. So resolution process, it's some of these things I think are going to overlap with the governance stuff you're talking about. So gathering data, being objective, and you want to do that for all parties. So you can't, whether you're internally biased or not, whoever's helping with this, make sure that you're gathering data for all parties, seek to understand, make sure that whatever the resolution, you're trying to not embarrass anyone. So if you're doing that, that's going to help with resolving the conflict. What are the common interests that are beneficial to everyone? Reinforce those agreed points. So as you're going through this, anything that's agreed, go back to the data and say, okay, we agreed on this, see how this is beneficial. Keep moving towards our common goals. Re-review any adjustments that you're going to make. So once you have a resolution, you want to review and say, here's the changes and here's the points and all of that. The facilitator, and this is kind of where I stopped. There's a few other points, but this is all I have on the map. So facilitator can't just be anybody. You got to make sure the facilitator is going to be trusted and build confidence with the parties that are in conflict, and they feel that they're headed towards a fair and reasoned approach to solving the conflict. Again, objectivity based on all those points, and then back those up with being honest. It should have been admit. It says admin, admit when you're wrong. Don't join the flame wars. So you may feel one way or the other, but don't join in. Don't be afraid to disagree. with other things. So this is about community. This is more of like who is a good facilitator. So if there's a problem or something, it doesn't mean you don't disagree. It's outside of the conflict. So if someone's doing something within the community, speak up, but don't join flame war stuff. Approaching conflict talks a little bit about this, like the positivity. Again, this is for the facilitator. Engaging with the parties equally. So you need to make sure to give everyone the same amount of time and document, keep everything open. You're not going to have meetings or whatever with one versus another that's not visible. Yeah, so that's the main parts. It goes into some more details on how to deal with those, like as far as like being clear with how things are documented, all the evidence. It's mainly going back through those different parts. Keeping conduct, everybody should be, make sure to, you want to take breaks if people are getting too tired. This may be a day, this may be, I think so one of the examples was like emails, 60 emails over a day resolving a conflict. But however it is, you want to put a stop if people are being abusive or rude, and we need to stop and then come back and that sort of thing. These are things we've looked at on other areas, but that's pretty good. And yeah, I'll stop there because it's actually goes into more details on those items.
Well, thanks for that. That was really good, and it kind of links to the governance. It was really hard to do conflict resolution without having some type of party that's assigned to handle the conflict. You can do it in the enlightened, structured way, I guess, if they're really good, I guess, communicators, and they're just actively trying to do this type of thing. But it's kind of like they're not accountable for it. So it, it can happen, but I don't know. I'm just imagining. I don't know of where. I guess in a Ruby community, Matt is the benevolent dictator, and the whole thing was like, be nice because Matt's is nice. That's how they try to handle the conflict. And when they come into what's going to be included into Ruby and what's going to be third-party library, there's some arguments there, and he kind of makes that final decision. But I don't know of any. Well, Rails community had massive fights, not so much Ruby. So interesting, the benevolent dictator, but then the structure of like a governance might have been able to handle some of those big Rails fights. So that would be interesting if they would have done that. I don't think we have enough time to do the events, but I think that I want to say he wrote this book for the events chapter. To me, it seemed like that's where he spent a lot of their step-by-step processes for how to do an event, and then everything seemed to link back to that. Some things just high level that I thought were useful were the sponsorship portion, where he says how to do pitch to a sponsor. So if you go through the book and hit that part, I think that was useful. These are just things that you just wouldn't want to learn on your own starting an event. You wouldn't want to learn by doing a lot of this stuff. You probably want to read through this chapter and not make the same mistakes. So does anyone have any overall opinions of the book that they want to contribute? Okay. I thought it was a a good book for open source communities. I thought I would recommend the book for the events chapter and the governance portion. Um, the Some of the other portions, I thought the last couple chapters started to get really practical. I mean, he's giving use cases and real life examples of handling conflicts and things like that. I thought those were good chapters and useful. So I'm always looking for counterintuitive truths in books. Like I don't want to come across something that's I don't just want to read all day about things that you could just sit around and think up or that are obvious. So there were some good insights in this book. But if that's it, if no one has any other comments, I think we should close the meeting because we're coming on an hour. Okay, thanks, and we'll be back next month for another session.